Welcome. In the last session, I was discussing about major abiotic factors, and in this session, I'm going to continue discussing about those major abiotic factors: the temperature, light, water, and soil. So, in the last session, already we have finished about temperature and water, and also I started with light. We'll continue discussing about that light. Right. So in the last session, I have said that the light, the source of the light is the sun, and and it's the main source for the process of photosynthesis in case of plants, right? And of course, in big jungles, due to the large canopy, there are certain plants who have adopted. So means under the trees, when there is no proper sunlight they get. So of course they get light, but the light will be of not so intense light they are going to get exposed. And even in such conditions, certain plants like these herbs and shrubs which grow to certain height, not just like the trees, they have adopted to live in low light conditions. So that's what we have seen. And the next point you'll see is that many plants, so these plants have adopted or depend on photoperiod. So many plants depend on photoperiod for flowering. So I hope we have studied a concept right of this in plant growth and development. So photoperiod is okay. So the time between the sunrise and sunset. Okay, so this will be between the sunrise and sunset. So that's what we say the photo period. And of course the photo periods will be longer in case of summers, and in case of winters the photo periods will be much smaller. So plants detect this photo period, and basing on that, so some are adapted to long days, some are adapted to short days, and so on, right? And here in case of animals also, so many animals use the diurnal and seasonal variations. So they use diurnal and seasonal variations. So they use diurnal and seasonal variations, okay, right, in the light intensity and the duration as timing for their foraging here, right? In the light intensity and duration for foraging, so means they go for okay finding the food, so depending on the light, right? So of course some have adopted to go for foraging in the daytime. So the organisms who are active during daytime, they are called diurnal. Okay, we have another word, so nocturnal. So nocturnal, which means in this case they are active during nighttime, whereas diurnal are active during daytime, okay. So these animals are going to use the diurnal seasonal variations, okay. That's the light intensity and duration, that will be for timing for their foraging, and even not only for foraging, for their reproduction, and also for migratory activities. So animals will show migration on the seasons, okay. So they go from okay less availability of food to more availability of food, okay, in certain conditions, or they may go for reproduction. So while they are reproducing, they go from the feeding grounds to breeding grounds. So that also requires the migration from one place to another place, right? And they use this the photoperiod for all these purposes here. Okay. And then uh, in case of oceans, so the oceans which are very deep, so in the oceans at the depths more than 500 meters, there will be no light. So because the light cannot penetrate all to that, if the water is shallower, then it can pass to the bottom of the ocean. So but in this case, okay, uh, when the waters are so deep, say this is the surface of ocean and this is the bed, and say suppose it is more than 500 meters in depth, the light will not be able to penetrate all to the ground, so it can penetrate only to certain extent. So here when coming to the bed, so it will be dark, so it will be dark. So to that depth the light will not be penetrating and there will be no light, okay, in these regions. And even though there is no light, we should not think that there will be no life present on the ocean bed. So yet even though there is no light, there is life present in those regions, right? uh, of course, certain organisms, as I said in earlier session, that there are organisms who live completely in darkness and they even do not know that the existence of sun. And okay, so this is one point, and one more point is that, okay, the right quality of light is also important. The quality of light is also important. Say that the light is having more amount of UV radiation. So if the light is having, so if light has more UV radiations, then we know that the UV radiations can cause damage to the organisms. Of course, it's the DNA that actually can get damaged to these UV radiations and can cause mutations, and then that can result in, okay, the death of organisms. So the quality of light is also important. We should see that the light has, less UV radiations. Uh, okay, and of course these UV radiations are mostly filtered by the atmospheric gases, but sometimes, the UV radiation still pass down and that can cause damage to the organisms. So that's all about the light, which is a very important right abiotic factor. The next one we shall see about soil. So we'll see about the soil here, right? So when coming to the soil, here the properties of soil and also the nature of the soil will be different from place to place. The nature and property of soil varies from place to place. It is going to vary from place to place. So when we see different locations, in your area, when you see in your agricultural land, okay, the place in which you live and the college in which you study, if you go on seeing the type of soil, you can see the differences in the composition of the soil, right? So the nature and property of the soil will vary from place to place, and it will depend on, so that nature and the property of the soil, okay, will depend on climatic conditions, depend on climatic conditions in that location. So it depend on climatic conditions on that location, and also the weathering process. So weathering process is the breakdown of rocks, and that results in the formation of soil, which takes several years. So these two things, depending on the climatic conditions and the weathering process, we see the nature and the property of soil. And these climatic conditions and weathering process will be different from place to place. Hence, the nature and property of the soil will also be different from place to place here. And not only the climatic conditions and weathering process, there are other factors which are also responsible for the nature and properties of the soil. So the one is whether the soil is transported, whether soil is transported or not. So the transportation of the soil with the help of water, when there is a rainfall or floods, the soil will be transported from one point to another point. Okay, so whether the soil is transported from one place to another place, or how the soil development occurred. Okay, that's I say soil development, how the soil development has occurred. All these also, these are also responsible for the nature and property of the soil. So not only they depend on climatic conditions and weathering process, but the transportation of soil or not here means the sedimentary. So means that remained in the same place, or whether it is transported to some other location. So I can say whether the soil is transported or it remained sedimentary, means at that location only it is formed and remain in that location. It is not going to move to some other place. Then we say it is sedimentary. So whether that soil is sedimentary or whether the soil is transported to some other point, or the type of development in the soil, all of them will be acting on the nature and property of the soil. Next, the percolation and water holding capacity of the soil. Percolation and water holding capacity of the soil. This is very important. Percolation means how far the water is able to pass from the surface of the soil into deep into the soil. Okay, so percolation and water holding capacity of the soil. So here if the percolation is not proper, means the movement of water from the surface deep into the soil is not proper, or if it is not holding the water at all, then it will result in the plants not growing in that location. So plants will not be able to grow. So if percolation is not proper, then there will be lodging of water, and we know in that conditions the plants will not be able to grow, because the roots will not be able to create oxygen, the respiratory gases. So for that reason the plants will die in that location. And if water is not holded in the soil, so if the soil is not able to hold the water, then the plants will not get the water, and as a result in that condition also plants will not be able to grow. Now this percolation and water holding capacity of the soil will depend on certain characteristics of the soil, like the soil composition, then the grain size, the soil composition, the grain size, okay, and the aggregation, okay, of those soil particles. All this will determine, so they are going to determine the percolation and water holding capacity of the soil. water holding capacity of the soil. Okay, so these two things are very important for the growth of the plants. So only if there is vegetation in that region, then it will attract the animals, and the different species of animals will try to live in that location. So when the plants are not growing, then definitely animals will not be able to live in that locations, right? uh, that determines the biodiversity of that particular location. So the percolation and water holding capacities of the soil will depend on such characteristic features of the soil. And here along with that, so plus we need to even consider the pH of the soil. So the pH of the soil is also very important, okay, for the growth of the plants, right? So the pH of the soil, then the mineral composition of the soil, the mineral composition of soil. So whether it is having a very good amount of minerals, and usually the pH of the soil in the neutral conditions, right, will favor the growth of the organisms, especially these plants. And so, and also the topography, and also the topography, so that area, the location where that soil is present. So the pH of the soil, the mineral composition of the soil, and the topography will determine the type of vegetation that grows in the location. So they are going to determine the type of vegetation. Say suppose if there is a more amount of water, then the plants that are able to live in the aquatic conditions, they will colonize that area. And if there is water availability which is medium, not pond, or you see that completely dry conditions, in that case you will find the vegetation that is adapted to live in mesophytic conditions, means not too watery or not too dry conditions. And if that is a dry area, then there are plants who have adopted to live in that dry areas. They will colonize that area. So that is what the pH of the soil, the mineral composition, and topography will determine the type of vegetation that will be growing in that areas. Right. And I already told you that depending on the vegetation, it will attract the animals. So depending on the type of vegetation, the animals that are adapted to that vegetation, means animals who have that feeding habits on that particular plant, if they are available in more numbers, so they will be living in those locations. So the type of vegetation will also determine the type of organisms that need to be present in that location here. Now, in case of in the aquatic environment, so in aquatic environment conditions, so in these aquatic environment conditions, okay, the bottom of the ocean or any river, pond, lake, so here those sediment characteristics, the sediment characteristics in aquatic environment, it can be oceans, it can be rivers, lakes, of course in the rivers also, whatever that sedimentation that we see at the bottom of the lake, pond, and so, and the rivers, this sediment characteristics will determine, so that will determine the type of benthic organisms, the type of benthic organisms in that location, the type of benthic organisms in that location. Okay, benthic organisms are the organisms that live close to the bed of an aquatic environment. So like in seabed or ocean bed or river bed or a pond bed, means So that's the almost what I say, the deepest part where uh, the aquatic organisms will be living. So those are called the benthic organisms. Of course, organisms will be distributed all throughout. Okay, some are adapted to live near to the surface of the water. Some are adapted to live, okay, in between the waters. I mean that at the center of that aquatic environment. Some have adopted to live the bottom of that aquatic environment, right? That sediment characteristics, that is the soil, what we see on the aquatic environments like ponds, rivers, lakes, and all, what kind of soil is seen uh, will determine the presence of that benthic organisms. So that's all about the four abiotic factors: the light, temperature, water, and soil. Now let's look at how the organisms are going to show the response to abiotic factors. So here the response is to abiotic factors. So responses to abiotic factors. Now here different organisms respond to these abiotic factors differently, and different organisms have adopted, okay, depending on the availability of temperature. Some require temperature, some require shade and cool or damp locations to live, right? And some have adopted, where there is a more intensity of light or there is a less intensity of light. All how these organisms have adopted, or they show the responses to abiotic factors. And of course this all happened in millions and millions of years, and the organisms adopted to these abiotic factors. Now some organisms are able to maintain a constant body temperature, while some others are not. Of course the majority of animals or plants, right, almost all plants, they have no ability to maintain a constant internal environment. So here, out of all the animals, right, almost all animals, or I say the majority of animals do not maintain constant internal environment. They don't maintain a constant internal environment. Okay, a very few organisms like these birds and mammals, okay, they maintain constant, right, internal environment. So however the environment changes, so that doesn't affect much these organisms when they are maintaining a constant internal environment. Okay, if they are not maintaining the constant internal environment, then the organisms have to respond to that abiotic factor. So if they feel that the temperatures are very high, then they need to move to some other locations where the temperatures are very less. And of course for these organisms the temperature should not go very less, means sub-zero conditions or very cool conditions, right, or they should not go very high. So they try to live in their optimum conditions, optimum temperature conditions. Okay, so here that constant internal environment is what I say as homeostasis. So the question comes that why most of the organisms, of course nearly all plants okay, don't maintain constant internal environment, maintain constant internal environment, right? So now the question comes that why most of the organisms are not able to maintain constant internal environment is that it all depends on energy. A lot of energy is required, okay, to maintain homeostasis. Okay, so energy is required, okay, for homeostasis, right? So that's to maintain constant internal environment, energy is required. So here the birds and mammals were able to get more amount of energy, so hence they were able to maintain a constant internal environment, whereas the other, most of the animals, and almost all plants are not able to maintain homeostasis, right? Of course, here I'll just mention it's a input of energy. High input of energy is required to maintain a constant internal environment here. If they are able to maintain the constant internal environment, okay, so these organisms will be able to live almost in every location. So that's why the success of the mammals is because of the maintaining these body temperatures, right? I mean constant internal environment. So you will see right from the North Pole to South Pole, even of course the most success of these mammals is because of that maintaining constant internal environment. And you will see mammals living right from north to south, okay, and from east to west. You will see everywhere they have been distributed. Now, depending on this, the organisms we have classified into three categories. So we classified the organisms into three categories. So they are conformers, okay. Conformers are the one who are not going to maintain constant internal environment. Then something called regulators, and then third one called partial regulators. So conformers, regulators, and partial regulators in this case. So conformers, I can say that they are like poikilothermic animals, or I can say them as ectotherms. The conformers are ectotherms. Okay. While coming to these homeotherms, the homeotherms will be endotherms, or I mean, sorry, the regulators are endotherms. The regulators are endotherms, or you can also call them homeotherms. Okay, so conformers or ectotherms, you can also use another word called poikilothermic organisms, and endotherms are called homeotherms, right? Uh, so here conformers will not be able to maintain constant internal environment, so they don't achieve homeostasis, whereas regulators have homeostasis, they achieve homeostasis. Partial regulators, I will discuss that one in detail. So to certain temperatures, they are not going to, maintain the internal environment, so they will be living as conformers, but beyond that they start regulating. So they are to some extent conformers, and to some extent they are regulators. So now let's look at a graph that gives an idea, right, between the external and internal environments. So let's say external level, and this will take internal level, okay. Now In case of conformers, when there is external level, okay, say temperature, if the temperature or the ambient temperature, means the temperature surrounding the organism, if it increases, then what happens is its body temperature also increases. So here the external factor which I have taken is a temperature. If the temperature surrounding that animal increases, then the body temperature of that organism also increases. So these are conformers. So that is the reason if the temperature becomes very high in the surrounding environment, they will be not able to cope up, hence they move to some other location. So that's why we see in some cases the organisms go for hibernation and some will go for estivation. So in summers, like in case of frogs, then the temperatures are very high, they cannot withstand that, so they they look for a cool, cool means that should be the warm and it should not be too cool also, right? They look for a warm locations and then they settle down and then they will take rest for a whole period of summer. Okay, that's what we call estivation. In other words, you can call it summer sleep, right? That's what in case of conformers. So when the external factors like this temperature increases, their internal temperature also will increase. But in case of regulators, so whatever the external or internal, so they are going to maintain, okay, same internal environment, so it will not depend on the external factors. So these are regulators. So they are regulators. And as I said, the partial regulators, when coming to the partial regulators, okay, they are going to have an increase in the body temperature to certain extent, okay, and after that they are going to maintain a constant temperature or internal environment. So this is about partial regulator. Here see, I have taken example of temperature for this external level. Okay, so when the temperature in the ambient, so ambient temperature increases, its body temperature also increases to certain extent, and after that it's going to maintain a constant internal environment. Say suppose we see in case of camels. So camels are examples in that case. Okay, so when the temperature rises to its internal temperature rises to, say suppose 40 degrees Celsius, till then they are not going to produce any sweat. Okay, of course the production of sweat actually cools the body surface. The evaporative mechanism of what I say, the sweat will actually try to bring down the body temperature. Now the camels are not going to produce sweat till they reach to 40 degrees Celsius, and if the temperature rises more than 40 degrees Celsius, then they start producing sweat. Okay, so that's they start, so till that point of 40 degrees Celsius, so as the external environment at 10 degrees 10 degrees Celsius, the internal environment will also be at 10 degrees Celsius, and if that goes to 20 degrees Celsius in the camel, okay, it goes to internal environment also goes to 20, and it till 40 degrees, so the body will also be at 40 degrees Celsius, and if it is beyond that, then it starts, okay, trying to cool down its body and try to maintain a constant environment. So that's the reason why we call them partial regulators. Okay, conformers, they will not achieve the homeostasis. Regulators are going to maintain a constant internal environment, and the partial regulators, it all depends on the situation. Okay, because in case of these camels, they need to conserve water, and we know how important the water in case of desert animals, right?